I want to be turning to 2 Kings chapter 17, and we'll be taking our lesson out of that chapter this morning. Heard the story of a doctor, he's a member of the church and an elder in the Lord's church, and he was fond of telling his patients, especially the ones who were members of the congregation, he was fond of giving them a verse after the office visit that would some way communicate his diagnosis and how things were going to turn out. And this elderly lady had visited him, and he told her, now you go home and read Hebrews 13 and verse 8. That's the passage that says the Lord is the same today, tomorrow, and forever. Well, what he was trying to communicate is you're not going to get any worse, probably won't get any better. It's just one of those things you have to deal with in life. Well, she got the numbers reversed like Brother Greg did this morning on the letters, and she went home and she read Hebrews 8:13. That which is old and waxeth aged is nigh unto passing away. So preachers and doctors, we get our tongue tangled sometimes, do we not? Have you ever wondered why the Jews in Jesus' day refused to have anything to do with the Samaritans? And why is it that Jesus selected to travel through Samaria intentionally on at least 2 occasions? Even though the Jewish tradition was when you were traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem, you cross over to the eastern side of the Jordan River, you travel south, and then you travel back to the west into Jerusalem. It added at least a full day's journey to the trip. So it was not the custom of Jews, because of their prejudice, to pass through Samaria. The title of my lesson this morning is The Religion of the Samaritans, and I want to be very cautious that when we study about the religion of the Samaritans, that we don't conclude, well, that's pagan religion, that's mixed religion. It has no application to me, but in fact it does have an application to us. If you're not familiar with the background of the carrying away of Israel, the nation of Israel, into captivity, you have a very concise explanation in chapter 17 as to what Israel did, and then consequently what God did, what his justice compelled him to do. And then you have some interesting historical information as to how that Samaritan, I would use the phrase, how that mixed race of Samaritans actually came to be, and why the Jews, the pure blood Jews, would tend to reject those Samaritans. I want to pick a few verses up in the first part of chapter 17. I'm not going to read the text as a whole, though some parts I'll be very close, so I hope you'll just follow with me. In verse 7, as you're getting the inspired record of this carrying away, the writer says it was so because the children of Israel had sinned. Look at verse 9. The children of Israel did secretly things that were not right against Jehovah. They built them high places in their cities. The high places were designed to set these idols up to get closer to heaven for whatever reason their imagination may have devised. Look at verse 10. They set them up pillars. Verse 11, they burnt incense in all the high places. Last of verse 11, they wrought wicked things to provoke Jehovah to anger. Verse 12, they served idols. Jump down to verse 14. Notwithstanding, they would not hear, but hardened their neck like to the neck of their fathers. Verse 15, they rejected his statutes. Middle of verse 15, they followed vanity. They went after the nations that were round about them. Verse 16, they forsook the commandments of God. Verse 17, this is one that I really struggle with, that human emotions and human compassion seems to be a natural part when we're born into this world. But these Jews had reached the stage where they caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire. and used divination and enchantments, and sold themselves to do that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah. If you've ever done some study about the worship of the god Moloch, it was a god, a statue that had brass arms, and they would heat those red hot, and they would take their children, their babies, and throw them into the fire, these arms of this false god Moloch. And in order to drown out the screams of the babies, the priests would beat on their drums to drown out the screams of those innocent children. The human race hasn't changed. We're still slaughtering children. We do it under the name of a different god, but it's still occurring. And deaf ears continue to be turned. I need to be careful lest I get off on a tangent here that I don't want to get off onto, but the human race can do unimaginable things toward their fellow human beings, can they not? Now look at verse 18. Therefore Jehovah was very angry with Israel. Don't miss the superlative in that. He was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah only. Now there were some that were left in the land to care for the land. Some of the peasants were perhaps left there. But now you have a void, a vacuum in that part of the world. And as was customary with the conquering nations, they would take some of the captives. After they had taken them home, they would send some captives from another land back into the land to care for it and to till it. And that's precisely what happens here. Start reading, if you will, with verse 21. For he rent Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king, and Jeroboam drove Israel from following Jehovah. Verse 22, and the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam which he did. They departed not from them until Jehovah removed Israel out of his sight, as he spake by all his servants the prophets. Now look at verse 24. The king of Syria brings men from Babylon and from Cuthah and Ava and from Hamath and Sepharvaim, various nations round about that they had conquered, and they placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. Now, God, in part of his punishment toward Israel, sent lions into the land because of these pagan gods, evidently, perhaps a part of the punishment toward Samaria in general. And these lions, when they came in, they began to devour the people. It was a hazard to the people that had been populated there. And so what they do is they cry out to the king. They want some kind of relief. Now look at verse 26. Wherefore they spake to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations which thou hast carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria know not the law of the God of the land, and therefore he has sent lions among them. Behold, they slay him, because they know not the law of the God of the land. I think the action of the king of Assyria is somewhat astonishing, and it would, if it weren't so serious, it would almost be humorous. If you will imagine when Israel separated, the nation of Israel separated, and in Dan and Bethel, a false god was set up, and you remember that Jeroboam made priests of various people from various lots of life. They did not come from the tribe of Levi. And as you study the nation of Israel, from Jeroboam onward, they just went down, down, down. There was never any good king in northern Israel. And now, with this corrupt priesthood carried off into captivity, the king wants to solve the problem with the lions in the land. So what does he do? He chooses one of those corrupt priests to send them back to teach them about Jehovah God. It's sort of like sending the foolish to train the foolish, is it not? So they were in a situation where they were not being taught correctly. and consequently there was not really any change in their life. I want to finish up just read carefully with me, verses 27 through 33. Then I want to give you 4 characteristics of the religion of the Samaritans, and then we'll make some practical application. Here's what the sacred writer records for us beginning in verse 27. Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, Carry thither one of the priests whom ye brought from thence. Let them go and dwell there, and let him teach them the law of the God of the land. And so one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel, taught them how they should fear Jehovah. Now keep in mind, they were already afraid. They were afraid of the lions, is what they were afraid of. And this priest was supposed to go back and teach them how they are to fear Jehovah. Verse 29, Howbeit every nation made gods of their own, put them in the houses of the high places which the Samaritans had made, every nation in their cities wherein they dwelt. And the men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth, the men of Cuth made Nergal, the men of Hamath made Ashimah, and the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak. Multiplicity of gods that are now brought into the land of Israel. And this is the priest that's teaching these people how they ought to serve the God of heaven. They're going from bad to worse, if they could get any worse. Look at verse 32. And so they feared Jehovah, made unto them from among themselves priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the houses of the high places. They feared Jehovah, and served their own gods after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away. Now when you look at this incident, and particularly the last half of the chapter, I think we can draw 4 important lessons about the religion of the Samaritans. And if we project that forward to the time of Christ, you get some indication as to why the Samaritans were so despised by the Israelites. But just as a side note, the Israelites weren't any better, as we'll see in the application of this. Let me give you 4 character traits. Number 1, the religion of the Samaritans is a religion of fear, fear-based religion. They did not fear God in the sense that they respected God. They did not fear Him in the sense that they had godly fear. You remember that the proverb writer tells us that the beginning of knowledge is the fear of Jehovah. Now there is a sense, and I don't want anybody to go out of here today and say, he's not afraid of Jehovah God. Oh yes, I am. There is a sense in which we do fear God because of His power and His might, His wrath that ultimately will come. But that trembling fear is replaced, hopefully as we grow and mature, by a deep respect for God. It's a reverential fear that we develop. And I think perhaps that's why John communicated to us that perfect love casts out fear. The fear of hell is a real fear. And I guess in the back of my mind, I never lose sight of the reality of what hell is. But I like to think that I've reached a point in my Christian journey where my love for God compels me to be what I ought to be. Fear-based religion has a number of character traits about it. I think for one thing, it actually suppresses activity. We end up like the one-talent man who took that talent and he buried it in the ground. And do you remember when the master came and asked for the relinquishing of that talent? He gave back the one talent, and he used this excuse, I feared thee. And he had a concept of his master that was not a true concept. That you plant where you reap where you don't plant. Well, no farmer expects to reap where he doesn't plant. But it's interesting that the master also in turn says to that one talent man, you perceive me that way? Then that's the way I'm going to be. Not in the sense that he was unjust or unfair when you apply it to Christ, but that was a fear-based religion. It suppresses participation. I envision every congregation something like this. If you will imagine a circle in which all the members of Forest Hill are members, we're part of that body. And the closer we get to the nucleus of that circle, the more involved we are, and that spreads outward. Hopefully the leaders in any congregation would be in the very nucleus. Deacons, teachers, Bible class teachers, good, faithful, godly men and women who make up the strong working nucleus of any congregation. And as you move out from the center, you have people who are a little bit less involved, a little bit less committed, hopefully in the process of growing and developing, till you get out to the outer circle, and you have inevitably those members who are on what I call the peripheral edge of involvement. They're there looking in, desiring to be a part of it. And sometimes our fear, the morbid fear of what people will say, how people will react, or how I'll look, and that keeps us from being involved as we should. So fear, this fear-based religion, actually causes us to become somewhat suppressed in our participation in the Lord's kingdom. But it also stifles my spiritual growth because I'm afraid to move any direction out of fear. We went through a period in the 1940s and the 1950s, and I guess to some extent even today, of struggling with a movement within the Lord's church that seemed almost afraid to do anything. They were afraid to look into orphans' homes and cooperation and mission work, and that developed into a strong following by those who held some of those positions. But in my experience, I have seen that those kind of congregations that are fear-based and are afraid to act, and I'm not suggesting an unscriptural, I think you know where we're coming from on this, that what they do is they end up not being involved, and they actually they compress the involvement, depress the involvement of the congregation as a whole. Someone once said, when morning comes, men laugh at the shadows. And so we're afraid of the unknown, and instead we're to have vision where we launch out, because God has told us what the unknown holds for us, does he not? The religion of the Samaritans is a fear-based religion. Let me give you a second character trait. The religion of the Samaritan is a form-based religion. They had their forms. Look at the gods that they had. Condybear and Howson have written an excellent book about St. Paul the Apostle. The epistles of Paul, the life and epistles of St. Paul. And when they arrive at the study of the section where Paul came into Athens, and they talked about the many gods that Paul saw in Athens, and you remember his conclusion was, I perceive that you are very religious, or one translation says very superstitious. The point being, there were multiple gods in Athens. And some of the Greek scholars used to say, the Greek ancients used to say, there were more gods in Athens than there were men. But here's the point that Condybear and Howson make. They said that with all their gods, Greek civilization never rose with regard to morals. It could not lift them up. It produced all kinds of psychology and philosophy and Stoic beliefs and Epicurean beliefs, but it did not change the life of an individual. Form-based religion is like that. And what you have here is the Assyrian who takes this priest and he takes them into a land where they'd been carried off anyway, and that corrupt priest is trying to tell them about the God of heaven, and you see what it produced? Each one of these individuals in the various cities had the different gods that were there. I think there's some important lessons to be learned from that particular characteristic of Samaritan-based religion. One is that form religion is vain. Look at what Jesus said about the Pharisees. In vain do they worship me, teaching as the commandments what? The doctrines of men. That's form religion. And we need to be very cautious always of taking tradition and binding tradition. There is such a thing as inspired tradition. But when it comes to human tradition, those things are not binding upon us. And that's why you'll find congregations throughout the brotherhood with various approaches in their worship, same avenues, but they arrange it somewhat differently. But when we talk about form religion, we're talking about going through the acts without any sincerity in the heart. In our hearts and hands meeting last night, one of the things I tried to share with our members is that you look at the name of this activity, hearts and hands. It starts from inside. It starts with the hearts and it's extended to the hands, not starting with the hands and trying to change the heart. But form religion it's just the outward form. There's nothing inside. Another thing about form religion is that it really can't change the inside man. And yet listen to some of the language in the New Testament. If any man is in Christ, he's what? A new creature. He's different. He's changed. Jesus said, out of the heart, the abundance of the mouth speaketh. You change the heart, you change the action. Have you ever noticed the contrast that Jesus makes in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, you have heard that it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, whosoever looketh upon a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery already with her in his heart. The superior law is you change the heart, you change the action. I was counseling with a young couple many years ago, premarital counseling. It may have been a Bible study. I think maybe it was a Bible study. And I got to this section on the change of the heart, and I said, I want you to look at the superiority of Jesus' law. And I focused on that passage in Matthew 5, and I used murder. If you're angry with your murder, with your brother, you just not carried out the act, but the malice is in the heart. And then I said, and if you look at a woman and you lust after her, you've committed adultery. I said, now which do you think is the better law? And the man said, boy, the law of Moses is. And I said, well, I've missed something somewhere. I said, why do you conclude that? He said, that way we can look all we want and not have to worry about it. I think he missed the lesson. The change is in the heart, brethren. And I'm back to this thing about the members who are out on the peripheral edge. Get the heart right, and everything else will naturally fall in place, will it not? The change comes from within. We are in Christ, we become a new creature, and thus we make the changes. Can I make just a real quick application here? I have seen too many occasions when someone will come for the Lord's Supper, stay for the Lord's Supper, and then leave. And I'm not talking about just because maybe somebody got sick. I'm talking about as a regular practice. I fear that those people do not recognize the substance of worship. God gave us 5 avenues. He expected us to engage in all 5 of them with our heart's intent. Mac Lyon told the story one time of a couple who were traveling on vacation. They pulled up to the church building just as the brethren were dismissing services, still dressed in their travel clothes. They said, can you bring the Lord's Supper out to us? We want to partake and be on our way. Mac Lyon said he opened his Bible up and commenced to preach to them. He got about 5 minutes worth of preaching, and they just cranked the car up and drove off. That's what we mean by form religion. And we need to be cautious that we don't try to place one element of the worship above another as if somehow that's superior. That's part of form worship. Let me give you a third characteristic. Not only is the Samaritan religion a religion of fear, and not only is it a form religion, but it's a religion of compromise. Everybody do their own thing. Let's don't be judgmental. Nobody's really wrong. Everybody's right. Does that sound familiar? Don't we live in an age today that says relativism, pluralism, don't be a judge? In fact, I think that Matthew 7:1 has probably replaced John 3:16 across those banners that you see at football games or baseball games. But we're in a non-judgmental atmosphere, and any attempt to try to point out wrong, you end up being criticized yourself. And isn't it amazing how people will judge you for being judgmental when they themselves are being judgmental about you being judgmental? Now, if you didn't follow that, get the tape and listen to it 2 or 3 times, if you will. But look at the religion of compromise. It's a religion of peaceful coexistence. We went through this unity movement. Attempt at a unity movement with the conservative Christian church 15, 20 years ago. And some of our brethren wisely pointed out we weren't the ones that left. We didn't introduce anything new, and that killed that unity movement rather quickly, did it not? But it was an attitude of let's have peaceful coexistence. The Bible never talks about that. When Moses stood before Pharaoh, he said, "You let my people go." Pharaoh made several compromises later on, and one of which he said to Moses, "You can go, your little ones can go, your family can go, but you leave your livestock here." Well, Moses knew they would need that livestock for sacrifices. And Moses made this observation to Pharaoh. He said, "We will go with our children, we will go with our wives, we will go with our flock. There shall not be one hoof left behind." Now, he could have compromised, couldn't he? Well, I'll leave 40% of the crop behind. God told him to take everything, and he complied strictly and obediently to what God told him to do. When Paul wrote to the Galatians in Galatians chapter 1, dealing with these Judaizing teachers, they wanted to put circumcision into the church. You have to be circumcised. Paul took Titus with him up to that meeting. He refused to circumcise Titus. Why? Because it was a matter of law and liberty. And then he makes this observation with regard to those Judaizing teachers. He said, "We did not give place, no, not for an hour." Not 1 hour. When you start compromising, there's no end to compromising. I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh a little bit more than I do now. In fact, I don't have much occasion at all to listen to him anymore. And he was a great political analyzer. And I suppose he still is. But he made an observation that I picked up very quickly that's applicable to the Lord's church. He said, when you have liberals and conservatives meet together to negotiate, conservatives always lose. Always. It's a step at a time going in the wrong direction. Isn't that true about the Lord's church and any error? Take whatever you want. Let's agree that we're not going to preach on marriage and divorce, and we'll just agree to disagree. Who lost? The people holding to the truth lost. Do you not see that? It's sort of like the story of the man that put a sign up outside of his shop, "Fresh fish for sale today." Somebody comes by and says, "We know it's today." He saws the word "today" off. Somebody else comes by and they say, "For sale? We know you've got a business." He saws the words "for sale" off. Somebody else comes by and on the other end it says "fresh." Well, we don't question your integrity. He cuts the word "fresh" off. Next fellow comes by and he says, "Fish today." He said, "We know it's today." So he saws the word "today" off. All that's left is the word "fish." And somebody came by and said, "Fish? We could smell it 3 blocks away." What's he left with? You see where compromise takes you? And that compromise is true not only in doctrinal matters. It applies to moral matters, my dress code, my ethics at work. You name it. Put any area you want to put it in. If you compromise the first step, you're on the way to full compromise. So this religion of the Samaritans was a religion that compromised. You have your God, I'll have my God. Let's never discuss it. And I'm sure you've heard people that have said essentially the same thing. Let me give you one last character trait of of the Samaritan religion, and that is it's a religion of shifted responsibility. If you look at verse 32, what did they do with these priests? They put these priests in the high places to sacrifice for them. You do it. Don't ask me to get involved. Well, preacher, didn't you know that Bible study is for the preacher? It's not for the common man in the pew. That's not the way I read the Bible. I actually had a sister in Christ tell me one time, I don't know how the discussion came up. She said, "I never read the Bible. I don't have to." I was sort of taken aback, particularly in view of how involved she and her husband were. And I said, "Where do you get your knowledge?" She said, "I listen to the preacher." I said, "What if the preacher goes sour?" I said, "Elder's job." I said, "You know elders can go sour too." Acts 20, Paul warned about elders being carried away from among their own selves. Brethren, there's no way that you can know whether I'm teaching the truth or Brother Barry Grider is teaching the truth, or anybody that stands before you, unless you know what's in the book. And if you fail to see what's in the book, if you shift that responsibility to someone else, you're not the better for it. You're the worse for it. But they had these priests who did what needed to be done for them. Did you know the Bible says that every one of us are priests? All of us. Had a denominational preacher ask me back when the women's liberal movement was first starting to get flaming. You remember when we were pushing that equal rights amendment across our country, and we were trying to defeat it to the best of our ability, and so these feminists were out there trying to essentially take control. And where was I going with that thought? It just went right out the it'll come back to me in a minute. Oh, I remember what it was. This denominational preacher asked me, he says, you folks in the Church of Christ have priests and women priests? I said, yeah, we have for 2,000 years. Boy, he was taken aback. Well, women are priests. Men are priests. And you can't shift the responsibility to fulfill that. I came across filed this little humorous quote away years ago, in fact, 1984 to be exact. Here's what one fellow writes: I went to my psychiatrist to be psychoanalyzed. To find out why I killed the cat and blackened my husband's eyes. He laid me on a downy couch to see what he could find, and here is what he dredged up from the subconscious of my mind. When I was 1, my mommy hid my dolly in a trunk, and so it follows naturally that I'm always drunk. When I was 2, I saw my father kiss the maid one day, and that's why I suffer now from kleptomania. At 3, I had the feeling of ambivalence toward my brothers, and so it follows naturally I poison all my lovers. But I'm happy. Now I've learned the lesson this is taught, and now that I've learned the lesson this is taught, that everything I do that's wrong is somebody else's fault. Boy, have we not come full circle in 30 years? Indeed we have. Now, do you see why the Orthodox Jew would be so opposed to that kind of religion? They wanted no part of it. And brethren, you and I, if we're going to be faithful, we can have no part of a religion that is a religion that's a fear-based religion, that's a religion of form, that's a religion of compromise, or a religion that shifts responsibility. And that's where the lesson comes in, the religion of the Samaritans. So we make a choice. Do I want to follow Christ explicitly? I want to go back and be, and even sometimes unintentionally, be what they end up being. And let's avoid that. Let's stay away from it. If you're not a child of God, we extend to you the Lord's invitation. It's always, His invitation is always ready. Come unto me, Jesus said, all ye that labor and are heavy laden. The bride and the Spirit say, come, Revelation chapter 22. The invitation is there. It's always God with opened arms, waiting and longing for people to respond any day, any time of the day, on any occasion. But we use the opportunity to make that convenient and to encourage you with a song that might help to make you make the correct choice. If you're a child of God, you've wandered away. Maybe you found yourself that your religion has become somewhat like what we've described, then make a change in your life. We're here to pray for you, to help you, and if we can assist you in any way, let's stand and sing if you need to come.